The Salty Dog Tavern sat on the edge of a quiet seaside town, the kind of place where locals gathered after long days and tourists wandered in, usually out of their depth. The wooden floors were scuffed from decades of boots. The air carried the scent of old whiskey and sea salt, and the jukebox hummed an old country tune. At the end of the bar, Frank Dawson, a 67-year-old retired Marine Corps veteran, sipped a cold beer. He wore a faded leather jacket over a simple flannel shirt, and atop his head sat his worn Marine Corps cap, the insignia barely visible from years of wear. His posture was relaxed but strong, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention. But still, people noticed him. Most of the regulars knew who he was. They knew about his time overseas, his medals, his service. And most importantly, they knew that he didn't tolerate nonsense. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Unfortunately, the group of drunken tourists who had just stumbled into the bar didn't know that. The door swung open loudly and Ryan Calloway wobbled inside, his arm slung over one of his buddies. He was in his mid-30s, rich, loud, and entitled. The type who had spent his life buying his way out of consequences. He was wasted, his expensive shirt untucked, his breath thick with overpriced liquor. His group, 3 other men just as drunk as him, laughed loudly as they made their way toward the bar, bumping into tables, knocking over a few empty glasses. The locals went quiet, watching. Ryan leaned against the counter and noticed Frank sitting alone. A smirk spread across his face. "Hey, look at this guy," Ryan said, nudging his friend. "One of those tough old men, huh? Bet he tells war stories to get free drinks." A few chuckles from his friends, but no one else laughed. Frank didn't move, didn't react. And that bothered Ryan. "Come on, old man," Ryan called out, his voice too loud in the quiet bar. "What's with the hat? You one of those guys who expects a thank you for your service every time you walk in a room?" A sharp tension filled the space. Even the bartender, Maggie, a stocky woman who had owned the bar for 20 years, paused mid-pour, her eyes narrowing. Ryan was too drunk to notice. Or maybe he didn't care. "You hear me, old man?" Ryan laughed, stepping closer, his words slurring slightly. "I mean, what's the big deal about being in the military anyway? You guys sign up for it, don't you?" Frank exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against his beer glass. The entire bar was watching now. Even Ryan's own friends started looking uncomfortable. The bartender cleared her throat, her voice sharp. "Son, you might want to sit down and shut up." Ryan smirked. "Oh, come on, lady. I'm just having a little fun." Then, he did the one thing no one in that bar could believe. He reached out and flicked the brim of Frank's Marine Corps cap. "Bet you wear this around hoping someone buys you a drink, huh?" The bar went dead silent. Frank set his beer down slowly. Then he turned, his steel blue eyes locking onto Ryan's. For the first time that night, Ryan felt something other than drunken confidence. He felt cold, and he had no idea why. The air inside the Salty Dog Tavern had thickened, the once lively chatter now replaced by a heavy silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Every pair of eyes in the bar was locked onto the scene unfolding between Ryan Calloway and Frank Dawson. Ryan, still riding the high of his own drunken arrogance, grinned, clearly unaware of just how close he was to crossing a line he could never uncross. He flicked Frank's Marine Corps cap again, chuckling under his breath. "Come on, old man, say something. What, too tough to take a joke?" Frank didn't react, not at first. He simply sat there, still as a rock, his hands calmly folded on the counter. But his eyes, the sharp, steel blue eyes of a man who had seen war, had lived through things Ryan could never comprehend, were locked onto him like a predator studying its prey. Ryan's confidence wavered, just slightly. Something in the veteran's presence unsettled him, though he wasn't sober enough to fully process it. The bartender, Maggie, shook her head. "Son," she said, her voice low but firm, "if you've got any sense left in that drunken brain of yours, you'll apologize and sit your ass down before you do something stupid." Ryan scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh, please. What's the old man gonna do? Give me a lecture?" He turned back to Frank and leaned in close. "Tell me, Grandpa, do you ever get tired of playing the brave soldier act? Walking around like the world owes you something?" Frank finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his beer, took a final sip, and set it down with a soft thud against the wooden counter. Then, with the same measured patience, he turned in his seat, his entire body facing Ryan. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" The question was so calm, so even, that it took a second to register. Ryan hesitated. The smirk twitched on his lips, but it didn't quite land. "Pfft, please. I've been in plenty of fights." Frank nodded once, slow and deliberate. I mean a real fight. One where, if you lose, you don't get to walk away." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ryan's fingers twitched at his sides, his brain struggling to process why this old man was suddenly making him so damn uneasy. Frank leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough so that only Ryan could hear. "You ever hear the sound a man makes when he knows he's not gonna make it?" His voice was quiet, steady, but it hit like a hammer. "You ever hold a friend in your arms while he bleeds out, knowing there's nothing you can do but keep him comfortable till the end?" Ryan swallowed, but his throat was suddenly too dry. "You ever have to tell a mother why her son ain't coming home?" Frank's gaze never wavered, his tone still dangerously calm. "You ever feel the weight of knowing you survived and someone else didn't?" Ryan's chest tightened. His drunken haze was beginning to fade. "You don't know a damn thing about me, boy." Frank's voice didn't rise, didn't waver. "You walk around with your fancy clothes and your loud mouth, thinking the world owes you something. But let me tell you something real simple. You don't know what it means to fight, to bleed, to carry the weight of men better than you who never got to grow old." Ryan took half a step back. For the first time in his life, he felt completely out of his depth. The entire bar was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Maggie smirked from behind the counter. "That feeling in your gut right now?" she muttered, shaking her head. "That's your common sense finally waking up." Ryan's lips parted, but no words came out. Frank exhaled slowly and turned back toward the bar. He picked up his empty beer glass and gave it a little tilt. "Another round, Maggie?" Maggie grinned. "On the house, Frank." The crowd chuckled. A few people shook their heads, turning back to their drinks. The tension in the air loosened, the moment fading. But Ryan? He was still standing there, frozen, because he had just realized something terrifying. Frank Dawson had just put him in his place without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, without even needing to stand up. And Ryan had never felt smaller in his life. Ryan's hands were still at his sides, clenched into weak fists, though he wasn't sure why. His chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on him. The noise of the bar had returned, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of conversation, but he felt like he was standing in a different world than before. He had come in loud, confident, untouchable, but now he felt like a fool. Frank Dawson had barely moved, barely spoken above a whisper, and yet Ryan could feel himself falling apart. His friends weren't laughing anymore. They stood behind him, uneasy, awkward, clearly debating whether to pretend they didn't know him. The regulars were shaking their heads, a few of them chuckling under their breath. Ryan tried to salvage the moment. He forced a smirk, even though his cheeks burned with humiliation. "All right," he said, his voice lacking the same arrogance it had before. "All right, I get it. You're a tough guy, old man." He exhaled sharply, trying to play it off, trying to take back control. Frank didn't even look at him. He took a slow sip of the fresh beer Maggie had poured for him and acted like Ryan didn't exist. And somehow, that was worse than being punched in the face. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, looking at his friends for backup, but they weren't meeting his eyes. He had been abandoned. He turned back to Frank, forcing a laugh. "What? You're just gonna sit there now? No big speech?" Frank finally sighed, setting his beer down again. He didn't turn to face Ryan, just shook his head, almost like he was bored. "Boy, I already gave you more words than you deserve," he muttered, his voice even. Ryan's breath hitched. The insult wasn't loud, wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact, like Ryan was a kid who had just been scolded by his grandfather. Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to lash out, but he had nothing left. He had thrown every bit of bravado, every insult, and none of it had stuck. Frank Dawson was a man who had been through real fights, through real suffering, and Ryan had been nothing more than a loud inconvenience. And the entire damn bar knew it. Maggie, still grinning behind the counter, leaned forward. "Hey, city boy," she said. "You want another drink?" might help wash down all that humble pie you're choking on." The room exploded with laughter. Ryan's face burned hotter than ever. He had no comeback, no way to salvage this. He had walked into the bar thinking he was the biggest man in the room, and now he wanted nothing more than to disappear. He swallowed hard, stepping back toward his friends. "Let's just go," he muttered under his breath. They didn't argue. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." They just nodded and followed him out, fast, eager to escape. As Ryan pushed open the door, stepping out into the cold night air, he heard one last thing before it shut behind him. Frank Dawson's low, casual chuckle. Because some men don't need to prove their strength. They already have. And Ryan had just learned that the hard way. Ryan Calloway shoved through the saloon doors and into the cold night air, his breath unsteady, his hands still clenched into useless fists. His ego was burning, his pride shattered. He barely heard the howls of laughter from inside as the door swung shut behind him, sealing him out of the world where he had been made a fool of. His friends followed behind, silent, their footsteps scraping against the cracked pavement of the quiet street. None of them spoke, none of them offered him a way out of his humiliation. Jason, his closest friend, let out a slow breath. "Damn, man!" Ryan's head snapped toward him, his jaw tightening. "Don't!" Jason held up his hands. "I'm just saying." "Don't!" Ryan snapped, his voice sharp. Jason didn't argue, but the look on his face said everything. Ryan had screwed up, and he had done it in front of an entire bar of people who would never forget it. He had walked into that saloon thinking he was the biggest man in the room, thinking his money, his confidence, his sharp tongue would keep him at the top of the food chain. But none of it mattered when he came up against a man like Frank Dawson, a man who had already faced the worst the world had to offer and survived, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to put Ryan in his place. The realization sat in Ryan's stomach like a rock. He had spent his entire life talking down to people, mocking them, making them feel small. He had never once imagined that one day he'd be the one feeling small. But tonight, in front of a quiet old veteran who hadn't even stood up from his stool, Ryan had finally been forced to face the truth. He wasn't as big as he thought he was. He had spent his life acting like the loudest voice in the room was the strongest one. But Frank had shown him that real strength doesn't need volume. Real strength is unshakable. Real strength is earned. Jason sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets as they reached the rental car. "You all right, man?" Ryan didn't answer at first. He stared at his reflection in the side mirror of the car, his own face still red with embarrassment. He had no smart comeback, no way to turn this into a joke. He had lost, and for the first time in his life, maybe that was a good thing. He pulled open the car door and slid inside. Jason climbed into the passenger seat. The other two guys lingered outside for a second, exchanging uneasy glances before getting in as well. As Ryan gripped the steering wheel, the sounds from the bar still drifted through the night. Muffled laughter, clinking glasses, the easy chatter of people who would remember this night long after he was gone. He exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he muttered, "I was an idiot." Jason blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Ryan shook his head, staring ahead at the dark road. "Forget it." He put the car in gear, driving away from the hardest lesson he had ever learned. Inside the saloon, Frank Dawson sat at the bar, finishing his beer. The night had gone back to normal, the way it always did. Because to him, Ryan was just another loudmouth who had to learn the hard way. And Frank had been teaching that lesson for a long, long time. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need to yell. Because some men don't need to prove their strength. They already have. And Ryan would never forget the night he learned exactly who he was messing with.